Today I'm going to be talking about the best settings for GoPro indoor lighting. In today's video, I'm filming using the GoPro Hero 10 right here, and then my Fujifilm X-T3 over here. So a lot of my best settings for GoPro indoor light are going to be very similar to my GoPro low light and GoPro night light video. If you haven't seen that video before, I encourage you to check it out, and I've linked to it above. But there are a few differences for the indoor lighting, and a lot of those relate to the use of artificial light. So when you're using artificial lighting inside, it does change some of the settings, and it's important to get those right. Otherwise, your footage may be unusable. If you're using good daytime natural lighting inside with a well-lit room, these settings do still apply, but you do have a little bit more flexibility with some of them. I'll go into detail when we get to that part. And also, some of the settings will be slightly different depending on if you're going to be moving around indoors with your GoPro, or if you're going to be filming stationary like I am right here. I will specify each of those settings so that it's clear what you need to set depending on your use case. Let's dive into those best settings. The first setting we want to take a look at here is we want to swipe down, and then we want to swipe left. We want to go to Preferences, and then General. And we're going to scroll down here, and you want to look at this anti-flicker setting right here. This setting is key when you're doing indoor filming, because lights tend to do a flickering. So if you were shooting in the United States, you want to make sure this is set to 60 Hertz. In the United States, 60 Hertz is the broadcast standard, and then in a lot of other nations, it's 50 Hertz. So make sure you have that set properly. And for video compression, of course, you want to make sure that's set to HEVC. This is going to enable you to use the highest mode possible on the Hero 10, which is 5.3K. Now that we've got those settings out of the way, we're going to go back here to the main menu, and we're going to click on the bottom here. Now, it doesn't matter which one of these presets you click on. You can choose any of these and configure it. For now, I'm just going to go to my cinematic one, because the settings that I'm going to show you are most similar to my cinematic. So we're going to click on that. We're going to click the edit menu. First setting you want to make sure of is you want to have the resolution on 5.3K 24. The reason for that, you want the highest resolution possible, which on the Hero 10 is 5.3K. And then you also want the frame rate as low as possible. So 24 is going to give us a lot more flexibility with that shutter speed, which is going to make a big difference with indoor lighting. And I'll explain that in a moment. So for the lens, we want to generally keep this to wide. And the reason for that is wide is going to use a lot more of the sensor versus if you set it to linear or narrow. Wide also is going to give you the most flexibility later on when editing. With wide, you can always crop it when editing and get that type of crop that you want for whatever scene you're filming. But if you do linear or narrow, it's cropping within the camera and you're getting less of a sensor readout. So for best quality, you want to keep it at wide, and then you can always crop it later on when you're editing. For Hypersmooth, when you're filming indoors stationary, you'll want to turn Hypersmooth off. Hypersmooth does present a crop in the video footage, and you don't want a crop going on. In addition, if you're filming stationary, you don't need to have Hypersmooth on because your camera's not moving. If you're filming indoors moving, I recommend having your GoPro on an external gimbal. So if you have it on a gimbal, you can also have Hypersmooth off because of that. If you haven't seen any of my videos on the gimbals that I recommend, I've linked to one of those above. That gimbal that I talk about is the Inky Falcon. But there's also another gimbal that I highly recommend for GoPros, and this one is called the Moza Mini P. I've linked to that in the description below if you want to check it out. The Moza Mini P does cost more than the Inky Falcon. However, the Moza Mini P you're able to use with a GoPro, with your smartphone, or with a small mirrorless DSLR. If you have really good natural lighting, it's okay to keep Hypersmooth on. And I recommend keeping that at standard. So if you're moving around indoor with really good natural lighting, standard is fine. I don't recommend going higher than that because it can create problems. And with that being said, standard could create problems as well. And if it's going to create problems, it's going to be because your camera sensor's just not getting enough lighting. So indoors, even when there's natural lighting, there needs to be a lot of natural lighting hitting that sensor in order for Hypersmooth to work properly. So if there's not enough lighting, Hypersmooth is going to struggle indoors, and it could make your video very jittery when you're moving around. So that's something I recommend testing out a little bit in your scene before you do your filming, and then look at the clip and make sure it looks good to you if you're not going to be using a gimbal. But if you are using a gimbal, you can turn Hypersmooth off. For scheduled capture, you're going to want that off. Duration no limit, hindsight off, timer off. In zoom, you want to keep that at 1.0. That zoom does crop if you do 2.0 because it's digital zoom, and you're going to have a lot lower quality video. You can always zoom later on when editing. For bitrate, you're going to want to have that set to high. For shutter, you're going to want to set this to 1/48. This is going to be the 180-degree rule, and you want to have that shutter speed set to twice your frame rate. And this is going to work particularly well indoors, because with artificial lighting, that shutter is going to really complement that 24 frames per second, and it's going to give you really good footage. The motion blur is going to look proper in it, and it's going to look really good. So you'll notice when you set the shutter speed to 1/48, the EV comp disappears as an option. If you do for some reason go with auto for your shutter, then you do have EV comp available. And as you know from some of my other videos, I normally recommend keeping EV comp at -0.5 or -1. But when you're doing indoor filming, EV comp can be set to 0 if your shutter is auto, because you don't need to compensate for overexposure generally indoors, unless you had a lot of really bright artificial lighting. This is the reason we have the frame rate set to 24 frames per second. If the frame rate was 30 or 60, that shutter speed's gonna have to be a lot higher. And when the shutter speed is higher, there's less light that's allowed into the camera. And when there's less light, that's gonna really hurt you with the indoor filming, because you need that camera getting as much light as it can without the footage looking weird. So that's why you almost always want to film indoors with 24 frames per second. For the white balance, this is one of those settings you have to be careful of indoors. So you want to be aware of what type of artificial lighting you have and what the temperature is. Typically with most light bulbs or any lighting that you have set up in your studio or filming location, you're generally going to be able to read on that and look it up and see what the lighting readout is. So in my case, I have lighting that has adjustable color to it, and my lights right now are set to 5000K. So therefore I have my white balance set to 5000K. So if your exact value is not available on here, you have a couple options. One option is to change your lighting to match one of the options on here. And the other option is to set this to auto. Auto is generally going to do a pretty good job, especially if you're indoors and stationary. However, if you are moving around indoors, you could run into a little bit of trouble if you're changing rooms with artificial lighting, if that lighting tends to be different. If you are just using natural lighting indoors and you don't have any artificial lighting on, I do recommend keeping it at 5000K. 5000K is the value I typically use most of the time outdoors in the middle of the day on a sunny or sun and clouds type of day. So 5000K is usually going to get you good results with the natural lighting as well. For ISO min, you'll want to set that to 100. And for ISO max, I recommend setting it at 400. Now, if you do find that your footage is still too dark indoors at 400, you could bump this up to 800. But I don't recommend ever going any higher than 800. Once you get above 800, you're going to get a lot of noise in your footage and it's not going to look good. And that's very difficult or impossible to correct when editing later on. So generally, I recommend maxing that out at 400 when the light will allow for that. For the sharpness, I recommend keeping this at low. You can always bump up the sharpness later on when editing. And for the color, you have a lot of options. There's not really a right or wrong color for this indoors. It's mostly going to just relate to your preferences. So I usually will pick flat or natural when I'm doing indoor filming. In today's case, I picked natural because I like how that looks. It does a good job with capturing the lighting and the color, and I'm happy with that. But if you want it really saturated, you could go up here to vibrant if you prefer that. But like I said, this is totally up to you. You really can't go wrong with this indoors, so pick what works best for you. And then for the audio settings, I do recommend using an external mic, or at the very least the media mod. That's going to get you the best audio results with the GoPro. But if all you have is the GoPro with the built-in internal mic, that's fine. And then for the wind, if you're indoors and there's no windows open or anything like that, you could turn the wind reduction off. That's what I would recommend. And And then the shortcuts down here, that's going to not apply in this case. I'm going to leave those all alone. I hope you found this video to be useful for the best settings for GoPro indoor filming. The GoPro Hero 10 and many other GoPros are very capable for indoor filming as long as you have the right settings. Until we talk again, happy GoProing.